Okay, so we're continuing in Yeshayahu, and guess who tonight Yeshayahu is going to target with his scathing criticism? Anybody have an idea? Who's
maybe the
going
king
to come under fire?
The king.
No, this week it's going to be women.
Oh yes.
Now Yeshayahu is really going to get everybody upset. Okay, so we'll see that soon. I just want to finish up one point from the first half of the chapter of Yeshayahu, what we've discussed already, and then we'll move on to the second half, and we'll see his new favorite target. Okay, so again, just a reminder what we spoke about last time. We saw Yeshayahu has this whole prophecy about the complete decimation of all people in leadership, power, military, economic, whatever it is. We saw that sort of the message of Yeshayahu was that there's going to be complete anarchy. Nobody's going to be left. And we saw he illustrated that in two interesting ways. One is the mention of even the Kosim, which is normally a bad leader, which we want to get rid of, but even that we won't have. In other words, we won't even have a soothsayer to turn to. It will be complete anarchy. And another point Yeshayahu was making was he was drawing out the comparison of Yiftach. Yiftach is like a leader that you wouldn't normally appoint, but if your back is to the wall and you have nobody else, so he's like, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but like to bring in Yiftach would be to bring in, the gangster or the mafia leader, whoever it is, the person who normally you would not turn to, but if your back is to the wall, then you'll turn to him. And Yeshayahu is saying even that is not going to be an option this time. Complete decimation. We did mention though that the king was left off of Yeshayahu's list of leaders that are gone because, as we'll see hopefully tonight, when this actually occurred, the king was sort of still standing, but there was nobody else on the board. So it's like having, if you're playing chess, so maybe you still have the king, but if you've got all your...
The reception's very bad actually, Diane.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
The connection is not good?
The reception.
Wait a second. So let me, hold on a minute. So as I was saying, Yiftach is sort of like the leader you would turn to when there's no other option. Even that is not going to be an option here, says Yeshayahu, and society is going to go into total anarchy. Okay, and that is the punishment. Why is all this punishment coming about? So essentially, it's because of the corruption of the leaders, that they abused their power and took advantage of the weak. Okay, and that's just the one point I want to finish up on from the first half of chapter 3. Where does Yeshayahu say this very clearly? He says it here. Okay, let's read. I'll just read quickly from verse 12 again. And try when I'm reading to pick up which word repeats itself constantly. There's one word here that constantly repeats itself. Ami nogsav meolel venashim mashlu bo. Okay, there's the women here is a hint to what's going to come in the second half of the chapter, where Yeshayahu is going to target the women. Okay, Ami me'ashrecha mat'im. My people's rulers are babes, it is governed by women. O my people, your leaders are misleaders, they have confused the course of your path. The Lord stands up to plead a cause, he rises to champion peoples. Adonai b'mishpat yavo im ziknei amo v'sarav, v'atem bi'altem akerem gzelat ani bevateichem. The Lord will bring this charge against the elders and officers of his people. It is you who have ravaged the vineyard. That which was robbed from the poor is in your houses. Malachem tedaku ami ufnei ainim titchanu neum Adonai Elohim tzvaot. How dare you crush my people and grind the faces of the poor, says my Lord God of hosts. So again, very clearly, the focus is on the leaders having taken advantage of the poor people, stealing and robbing from the poor. Okay, now did anybody pick up on which word repeats itself quite a bit here in these verses?
Ami.
Ami, very good.
Yes.
So you have here, let's count how many times. Ami once, Again here twice 2. Ladin Amim. Amim Ami. Third time. Ziknei Amo, 4. Malachem Tedaku Ami, that's 5. And I think you have earlier a few more. K'tzin Am, that's 6. And here also you have Venigasa Am in verse 5. Okay, 7 times the word Ami or some version of Ami, Am, etc. appears in this chapter. Okay, this is an interesting point. The one who did quite a bit of analysis on this was Nechama Leibovich, Zichrono Livracha, right? The very famous woman author who taught and wrote extensively about Chumash, also a little bit about Nevi'im, but primarily she's known for the work she did on Chumash and Torah. And one of the concepts that I'm not sure if she was the first one to speak about it, but certainly she developed, is the concept of a milah mancha. It's like a keyword that repeats itself, and oftentimes it repeats itself 7 times. This is not an uncommon occurrence. In other words, the number 7 is not random. Okay, this is a number which often you'll see comes up when you have these words that repeat themselves, and it's coming to send a message. In other words, the constant other words of the word am again is the people. And that's the contrast that's being made here. You have these leaders, but what are they doing to the people? You are oppressing the people, you're robbing from them. Okay, and this is what we saw Yeshayahu was speaking about in the first chapter. In other words, the time of Uzziah was clearly a time of wealth, but all that wealth was not taken in a just way. In other words, rather than having people's ownership's rights being respected, the people at the top echelon of the leadership were robbing the poor, and they were hoarding all the wealth to themselves. Okay, and that's the contrast that Yeshayahu is speaking about. The am. That's what he keeps repeating about the am. What about the people? The people, and that's why the punishment for this upper tier of society is that they're going to be completely wiped out. Again, the result of this will obviously be horrendous for everybody. In other words, it will cause poverty, it will cause anarchy. Okay, that's what he described. And we saw a bit of the poverty as well. When they tell to the person, they try to ask him, be our leader, and what does he say? I don't have, food or clothing for my own family. I certainly can't be a leader of the people. So that's the result. But that's the result of the punishment, but that's sort of the necessary step that needs to be taken in this situation. And this, by the way, this is the humbling of man that Yeshayahu spoke about in the previous chapter, in chapter 2. We spoke about the humbling of man. How will that humbling of man express itself? It will express itself in this anarchy and in this poverty, which will come about, which will be a complete contrast to the times of Uzziah, which were a time of wealth, a time of international relations, etc. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Julia.
Why is he so rude about women, given the prophetess's Devorah was extremely strong and successful, and a number of others? I mean, was he? I didn't put him down as a misogynist, but I mean, clearly he had a problem.
No. Well, first of all, we haven't even gone to that yet. That's what we're going to read now.
There's a reason. May I ask a question, Dan?
Yeah. No, I just want to answer Julia.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's not attacking all women. He's just going to attack, specific women, the women of Yerushalayim. Okay. Yeah. I started out as if he's targeting all women. That wasn't my intent. He's going to target specifically the women of Yerushalayim, and we'll see exactly which women he's targeting. Okay, but
it's like Amos talking about the dying. It's like Amos talking about the women lounging on their chaises long with their painted nails and so on. It's the upper class women.
Yes. Amos, we'll see that as well. As Amos is also going. Amos is again a parallel prophet to Yeshayahu, and he also speaks about the women of that time. And they're not targeting women per se. Just like when they're targeting men, they're not targeting men per se. They're targeting certain people who behaved in a certain way.
May I ask a quick question, please?
Yeah.
You mentioned about, we said Ami was the one, was the Milah Mancha, but and the Dayan says something about Sina. Maybe I didn't hear correctly. Something about the word Ami connected with Sina. Or did I not hear you correctly?
No, just Ami as people versus.
Oh, no, I thought I heard another word. Okay, sorry, then it's my fault. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so without further ado, we will go on to the next half of the chapter.
Oh, Ami v'sarav, that's right.
Ami v'sarav.
That's right. I thought I heard Sina, so thank you.
Right, okay. So again, so now as we read, you know, I once had, when I was studying for my B.Ed, so there was a certain teacher, he said, you should never read a text and just go ahead and read it. You always have to give some sort of direction to the people listening, you know, what they should be looking out for. So I'll try to follow that instruction. So what I suggest is while we're reading the second half of chapter 3, try to think about, you know, what here resembles what we had in the first half, because as we'll see, there are certain parallels between the second half and the first half of the chapter. Okay, so let's go ahead and see it. Okay. So we're reading now from verse 16 in chapter 3 until the first verse of chapter 4. For some reason, whoever did the division for chapters, I'm not sure why he made the first verse of chapter 4 like he started a new chapter there. To me, it really seems to be part of the second half of chapter 3. So that's why I connected it here rather than breaking at the end of the chapter. I broke after the first verse of chapter 4. I'm not sure what he was thinking here. Whoever was the one that divided into chapters. Again, the division of chapters is not a Jewish tradition done by Christians. It doesn't mean it's not good. It usually is good, but in this case, I think they were off by one verse. Okay, so it says in verse number 16, Vayomer Adonai, Ya'an ki gavhu bnot Sion v'telachna netuyot garon, ומסקרות בעיניים, הלוך ותפוף תלכנה וברגליהם תעקסנה. The Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are so vain, and walk with heads thrown back, with roving eyes, and with mincing gait, making a tinkling with their feet. וסיפח אדוני קודקוד בנות ציון, ואדוני פותן יערה. My Lord will bear the pates of the daughters of Zion, the Lord will uncover their heads. ביום ההוא יסיר אדוני את תפארת האחסים והשביסים והסהרונים, הנטיפות והשירות והרעלות, הפערים והצעדאות והכישורים ובתי הנפש והלחשים, הטבעות ונזמי הזהב, המחלצות והמעטפות והמטפחות והחריטים והגלינים והסדינים והצניפות והרדידים. Okay, and what does that translate to? In that day, my Lord will strip off the finery of their anklets, the fillets, and the crescents of the eardrops, the bracelets and the veils, the turbans, the armlets, and the sashes of the talismans and the amulets, the signet rings and the nose rings of the festive robes, the mantles and the shawls, the purses, the lace gowns and the linen vests, and the kerchiefs and the capes. והיה תחת בושם, מה קיה? ותחת חגורה נקפה, ותחת מעשה מקשה כורחה, ותחת פתיגיל מחגורת שק, כי תחת יופי. And then, instead of perfume, there shall be wrought, and instead of an apron, a rope, instead of a diadem of beaten work, a shorn head, instead of a rich robe, a girding of sackcloth, a burn instead of beauty. מתייך בחרב ייפולו וגבורתך במלחמה. Her men shall fall by the sword, her fighting manhood in battle. וענו ואבלו פתחיה ונקטע לארץ תשב. And her gates shall lament and mourn, and she shall be emptied, shall sit on the ground. והחזיקו שבע נשים באיש אחד ביום ההוא לאמור. לחמנו נאכל ושמלתנו נלבש, רק יקרא שמך עלינו סוף חרבתנו. And in that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat our own food and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. Wow. Okay, does anybody want to try and say? Okay, so clearly here Yeshayahu is going after the women of Yerushalayim of that time. That's how he starts off. Yan ki gavhu benot Zion. Okay, what can you tell me what in just in the literary style, before we analyze what's going on here more specifically, what is similar here in just the literary style to the first half of the chapter?
It's about destruction, isn't it? It's about what will happen. I mean, this reminds me of the Chorban, but you know,
Clearly he's saying very bad things will happen, but I'm not yet focusing on the content. I'm just trying to focus on the literary style. Okay, what is similar here to what we had in the first half in terms of just the style of that he's using, the technique, if you would call it, without getting into the content so much?
I see.
Does anybody have an idea?
Very poetic.
What? I'm sorry?
It's very poetic, I think, actually.
Okay, yeah, but poetic is very general. Can you be more specific? What kind of poetry technique is he using here? Which is similar to the technique he used also in the first half of the chapter.
Is it repetition?
Yeah, what do you mean by repetition?
A listing of...
Ah, very good. So you have here a long list. What was the list that we had in the first half of the chapter? A list of what?
The rulers.
Different types of men.
Yeah, the leaders, the types of men. And if you remember, it was also the same expression of Yasir. Okay, let me quickly switch to the first half of the chapter so you can see it.
You say bimkom, in other words, instead of so-and-so, you'll have so-and-so.
Wait a second. I'm just going to the first half so you can see the parallel. Here it was also ki hinei Adon Hashem tzvaot mesir. He will remove. And here we also have the same type of expression. Bayomahu yasir Hashem, he will remove. Now in the first half, he was removing all the leaders. What is he removing in the second half? What is this list of?
All the wealth.
All the trinkets.
All the jewelry, whatever it is that the women are wearing.
The physical signs of wealth and leadership and power, really.
Yeah, so here, by the men, it was the positions of power that he was removing. By the women, it's essentially all their jewelry, clothing, etc., all this wealth. And he's got here, I actually counted it. I forgot what was the count. I think it's something like 18. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Okay, just in verse 23 already, and he's got hinted to in verse 24 already also. All these jewelry, clothing, shawls, etc., purses, whatever it is, all of this is going to be removed. Okay, so that's essentially the in terms of a literary technique, he's sort of using the same technique. He's got this long list, and he's saying God will remove all this, will take all of this away from you. Okay, now, how is this going to happen more precisely? What's going to essentially happen? How is all this going to occur? Does he tell us how this is all going to happen?
By battle?
Battle, very good. Where do you see battle? You're correct.
Verse 25.
Right, so who will die in battle?
The men will fall by the sword.
Exactly, so all the men will die. So essentially all these women will, what will they be now?
Widows.
Widows, and that's exactly what it says in verse number 26. Okay, now they will all be widows. Okay, and what will there be a shortage of?
Men.
Husbands.
Husbands, right? So now you have, and that's why I think clearly verse number 1 of chapter 4 is a direct result of this. After all the men will die and all these women, which were previously adorned by this jewelry and this jewelry will now be replaced by these clothes of mourning, now they need a man. So you have a situation of 7 women. Again, 7 is an expression. It doesn't have to be a precise number. It's just an expression for many women trying to grab even one man. And what are they telling him? What is meant by this? When they tell the man, we will eat our own food and wear our own clothes. What are they saying, essentially?
They'll give away their riches. They won't start putting a lot of onus on their husbands to give them so much wealth. They'll live quite sparsely.
Okay, yeah, very good. Anybody want to add to that?
Self-supporting and not necessarily living with them in the fullest, not necessarily sleeping with them either.
Right, so it's very interesting. So al pi halacha, the man has 3 main requirements to the woman, okay? One is to provide her food. The second is to provide her clothing.
Yeah.
And the third is to have marital relations with her. So essentially, the women are willing to marry under the condition that the husband will not need to provide them food or clothing. Okay, these 3 obligations are mentioned in the Torah. At least according to most commentators, it says she'era ksuta ve'onata lo yigra. So she'era is a reference, at least according to the more prevalent explanation. She'era is a reference to food. Ksuta is ksut, is clothing, and onata is the regular marital relations, which al pi halacha vary depending on the couple, the man's profession, etc. But that he's required from time to time to have relations with his wife. So essentially, these women are offering the men to be married under the condition that they will not need to provide for them. In other words, that's what they're saying. Lachmeinu nochal, ksuteinu nilbash. Okay, we will eat our own food. We will wear our own clothing. In other words, you're not required to provide any of that for us. And it's interesting, actually, al pi halacha, the way we rule, you are allowed to make such a condition when you get married, that if they both agree, then they can stipulate that at least the monetary obligations, the man will not be obligated to the wife.
I thought that these were actually part of the ketubah, and the ketubah was standard.
Yes, the standard is that a man is obligated that to the woman, and it's listed in the ketubah. We say ana izun v'afarnes v'chalkel. We list all that in the ketubah. I'm saying theoretically, I've never seen or heard of this actually done in practice, but theoretically, if a man and a woman will want to negotiate and exclude that obligation, they are able to do that. It's all, if I wouldn't advise it, but theoretically it can be done.
Well, are they allowed to exclude the obligations of conjugal rights?
Of what?
Of sleeping together? Are they allowed to?
That's an interesting discussion. According to the Rambam, you cannot do that because only on the monetary aspects you are able to make the t'nai, the condition. But he says the ona is an obligation which is not monetary, it's sort of like a physical obligation. So that's not subject to making conditions on, according to the Rambam. But on the food and clothing, that's what we call a t'nai shebemamon. T'nai shebemamon, a monetary condition, works even on obligations which are from the Torah. You can stipulate otherwise, a monetary. So theoretically, if let's say you have a situation where men are very hard to come by, which is essentially what Yeshayahu is describing here. So for every man, you've got 7 women jumping at him. So the man has room for negotiation. So he can say, okay, I'm willing to marry, but only if you're forfeit all your all the monetary obligations that normally a man has to the wife. So that's sort of Yeshayahu trying to depict the desperation of the women here after all these men will die. So you have 7 women grabbing a man, and essentially they're saying, okay, we're forfeiting all our monetary rights, just marry us. Take away our shame of being widows. Okay. Now, what does this remind you of from again, I'm talking about from the literary style, from the first chapter? What do we have parallel to this in the first chapter?
In the first chapter, somebody was offered the leadership and said, well, no, I haven't got clothes and therefore I don't want to be the leader.
Exactly. In other words,
Yeah.
you also have that same desperation. You have they're turning to this person, grabbing him, right? We also had kit post ish b'achiv, right? So we have that expression, grabbing onto somebody and begging him to be the leader. And that's what you also have here, the women grabbing in the man. They're grabbing onto this man in desperation. And again, you have the mention, like you said, of the clothing and the food. So in the first half of the chapter, the response of the man who was asked to be a leader, I don't have food and clothing in my own house, so I can't be the leader. And then similar to that here, you have the woman turning apparently to this man, who's left standing after most of them died. And they're saying, okay, forget about food and clothing. We don't even need that. Just marry us without giving us anything. Okay, so that's also parallel to the first half, that kind of desperation. Okay, so clearly here to see the parallels to the literary style, at least to the first half. Okay, now what does Yeshayahu want for their women, from these women? What is their sin? Does anybody have an idea?
I have a feeling that it was the women who were demanding so much from their husbands. It was really a lot, you know, all this luxury that really it brought their husbands down. They were more worried about, you know, furnishing their wives with their unnecessary needs rather than worrying about the people. They didn't care about the poverty that was going on. At that time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Frank.
No, that's what I said. I'm sorry.
Vanity.
Right. So it's the vanity of the women. We have that expression, Yain ki gavhu b'not Zion. Again, that expression of the gava, the vanity, the haughtiness. And I think, like Flora said, we'll soon bring further proofs for this. If Flora, I'll take what you said and use it again a bit cringingly. But you know the expression, you know, behind every successful man, there's a woman. So according to Yeshayahu here, you would say behind every corrupt man, there's a woman who's driving him to this corruption. In other words, essentially, and we'll see this accusation also more clearly in Amos, in the parallel to Amos, that these women, in sort of their demands for all this luxury, they were in essence partners to the crimes of the husband in robbing and oppressing the people. And that's why, you know, all this luxury and all these symbols of luxury, that's the punishment for them, that all of these will be removed, they'll become widows, and they'll be destined to poverty and to this desperation. Okay, so where do we see that? So again, as we always say, Yeshayahu, he's not working alone. There are other prophets, parallel prophets in his time. And one of those, as we spoke about in the past, is Amos. So we'll see Amos also comes up after these women. Okay, Amos also uses some really difficult expressions. Let's see what he says. Okay, this is in Amos chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Okay, really brace yourselves now. He says as follows: שמעו הדבר הזה, פרות הבשן אשר בהר שומרון, העושקות דלים, הרוצצות אביונים, האומרות לאדוניהם הביאה ונשתה. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, on the hills of Samaria, who defraud the poor, who rob the needy, who say to your husbands, bring and let's carouse. נשבע אדוני אלוהים בקודשו, כי הנה ימים באים עליכם ונישא אתכם בצינות, ואחריתכם בסירות דוגה. My Lord God swears by his holiness, behold, days are coming upon you when you will be carried off in baskets, and to the last one, in fish baskets. ופרצים תצאנה אישה נגדה, וישלחתנה הארמונה נאום אדוני. And taken out of the city, each one threw a breach straight ahead and flung on the refuse heap, declares the Lord. Okay, some really difficult expressions here by Amos. See how he calls the women. He calls them Parot Bashan, the cows of the Bashan, the defraud the poor, rob the needy, Ha'omrot la'adoneihem avia v'nishteh, who call to their husbands, bring more, and we will drink it. Okay, now here the Radak, really explains why this accusation against these women. So he says, Shim'u parot Bashan. Why is he using this expression? He calls them the cows of Bashan. So he says, Bashanu mikom mar'eh shamen, ve'abehemot haro'ot bo shmenot ve'tovot. In other words, the animals, the cows of these places, they're considered to be, very fatty and very good meat. V'dima neshei hamelachim v'asarim hagdolim leparot habashan lefi shehem ba'alot ta'anug ve'en shmenot ve'yafot. So he's depicting the wives of these kings, these leaders, these ministers, whatever they were, to the Parot HaBashan, because they too were indulging themselves in all these pleasures. And what was the crime in this? So that's what he says, Ha'ushkot dalim. Shehen mesavevot ha'oshek ve'amerutza. In other words, they're the ones bringing about this thievery and robbing of the poor. Why? She'omrot le'adonihem shehen ba'alehem avia v'nishte. They're telling their husbands, bring us more, bring us more. ואם אין לבעליהם הכסף משלהם בהזמנה, עושקים החלושים שאין להם כוח להימלט מידם. And the husbands, to provide the demands of the women, they have to rob the poor and take more. גם רוצצים אותם אם לא ייתנו מיד על פיהם, and they beat them down if they don't give up immediately for their demands. So that's, in other words, that's why both Yeshayahu and Amos view the women as being partners in the crimes of their husbands, in participating in the indulgence, in the encouragement of their husbands to rob the poor. Okay, so I just wrote here what we spoke about. So again, verses 16, and just in terms of the structure of this section of the chapter, 16 to 17 is the sin of the daughters of Zion and the judgment that Hashem will do with them. Okay, that's Vayomer Hashem, Yanki Gavu Benot Zion, etc., because they walk with their heads, etc. And then they will Sipach Hashem Kodkod Benot Zion Hashem Potchen Yareh. That's the punishment to them. And then verses 18 through 23 is the list of all the jewelry, etc., everything that God will take away from them. Then 24 through 26 is the verses that essentially all these jewelry, beautiful clothing, etc., will be replaced by mourning for all the husbands that will die. And then in verse number 1 of chapter 4, as we said, that's the sort of the lowest point of desperation, where you have all the women turning to one man and in desperation asking him to marry them, even without any monetary benefits, etc., as we discussed. Okay. So now the question is, when did this all happen? Okay, because usually, in other words, when we have these prophecies of Yeshayahu or others, we always have to try to see, where did this happen? If it happened already, obviously some prophecies, we're still waiting for them to happen. Like we had the prophecy about Yerushalayim becoming the center of the world. But some of these prophecies are to the not so distant future. Okay, so the question is, if we can pinpoint when precisely this happened, then it will give us a better understanding of what Yeshayahu is talking about. So here it seems actually quite clear what event Yeshayahu is referring to. And this the Radak points out. Okay, the Radak in his commentary, he says here in Yeshayahu in verse number 1 in chapter 4, he says, when did this occur? וזה היה בימי אחז, שהרג פרקח בן רמליהו ביהודה 120,000 ביום אחד, ונשארו אנשים, ועל זה אמרו, עצמו לי אלמנותיו מכל ימים. Okay, so the Radak says that we know that this prophecy of Yeshayahu about all these women becoming widows occurred in the times of Achaz. Again, I'll remind you the order here. Yeshayahu is now speaking in the times of Uzziyahu. After Uzziyahu, we will have Yotam, and then we will have Achaz. So Achaz is the grandson of Yeshayahu, and Yeshayahu was still alive in the times of Achaz, and he prophesied to Achaz as well, as we will learn. So this was an event in which Pekach ben Remaliyahu, whom we'll see what that was, killed 120,000 men in Yehuda in one day. So in one day, 120,000 men were killed. All these women became widowed, and he says this is what, he quotes here a verse from Yirmiyahu that says that we will have more widows than sand on the beach. In other words, and that occurred on that day. Okay, so let's now see what exactly is the event that he's referring to. And we'll see how it ties in actually to everything we saw in chapter 3. So what the event that he's referring to is described in Divrei Avim chapter 28. Okay, so that's what we'll read now. So it says, Ben 20 shana achaz b'molcho, ו16 shana malach b'Yerushalayim, ve'lo asa ha'yashar b'nei Adonai keDavid aviv. Okay, so we're talking about some years later, then Uziyahu, again, his grandson is now the king. Achaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was pleasing to the Lord as his father David had done. But followed the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made molten images for the Baals. Okay, so he was involved in idolatry. He made offerings in the valley of Ben Hinnom and burned his sons in fire in the abhorrent fashion of the nations which the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites. He sacrificed and made offerings at the shrines on the hills and under every leafy tree. ויתנהו אדוני אלוהיו ביד מלך חרם, ויקעו בו וישבו ממנו שבייה גדולה, ויביאו דרמסק וגם ביד מלך ישראל ניתן, ויח בו מכה גדולה. And the Lord his God delivered him over to the king of Aram, who defeated him and took many of his men captive and brought them to Damascus. He was also delivered over to the king of Israel, who inflicted a great defeat on him. ויהרוג פקח בן רמליהו ביהודה 120,000 ביום אחד, הכל בני חיל בעוזבם את אדוני אלוהי אבותם. Pekach, son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 in Judah, all brave men, in one day because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. ויהרוג זכרי גיבור אפרים את מעשיהו בן המלך ואת עזריקם נגיד הבית ואת אלקנה משנה המלך. Zichri, the champion of Ephraim, killed Maasiyah, the king's son, and Azrikam, chief of the palace, and Elkanah, the second to the king. וישבו בני ישראל מאחריהם 200,000 נשים, בנים ובנות, וגם שלל הרב בזזו מהם, ויביאו את השלל לשומרון. The Israelites captured 200,000 of their kinsmen, women, boys, and girls, and they also took a large amount of booty from them and brought the booty to Samaria, to Shomron. Okay, so what happened here? So in essence, we have Achaz. He's not following the footsteps of his more righteous fathers. He's turning to idolatry. And he's being attacked together by Aram. Aram is the nation which was up in the area of what we call nowadays Syria. And also together with Aram was Melech Israel, the kingdom of Israel. Both of them joined together to attack Yehuda, to attack Achaz, who was the king of Judah. Okay, when we get to this stage, we'll discuss this when we get to the 7th parak of Yeshayahu, which we're not so far from there. We're now completing 3, so we have 4 and 5. 6 we already did, and then so we don't need to do 6, so we'll get to 7. So we'll discuss exactly what was going on here, what happened that both Aram and Israel decided to attack Yehuda. Okay, we'll see we'll try to understand at least what the reason for that was. But in essence, you have here this devastating attack where you have 120,000 men being killed on one day. So that's the Radak, that's what he said. This is all the men being wiped away and all the women remaining as widows, what Yeshayahu described in the second half of the chapter about all the men falling in battle and the women being remaining widows. And we also have here in verse number 7, we see here all the positions of power being killed. So you have the heir to the throne, Masiyahu ben Amelech, who's the supposed heir to the throne of Achaz being killed. You have Azrikam Nagin Abai, the chief of the palace, the Mishneh Lamelech, the second to the king. In other words, this is hinting to Achaz himself did not die here. but all the positions of leadership below Achaz were killed. Okay, that's in essence what's being described. And that ties into the first half of the chapter of Yeshayahu about all the positions of power being removed. Again, the king himself remains, but he remains basically an impotent king with all his government being destroyed. And the women, like we said, all these men were killed. So all these women who were previously had all this wealth will now become poor and poor widows, essentially, is the result. Okay, and this is all, again, this prophecy of Yeshayahu, all of this is occurring, as we said, because of the lack of justice, the corruption, the robbery, etc., the oppression of the poor, of the people, so to speak, as he spoke about in this chapter, and that all of that is going to take place, as we said, not in the not so distant future from this time, already in the times of Uziah's grandson Achaz. Okay, any questions or comments on this? Okay, very good. So next time we'll continue to chapter 4. In chapter 4, we'll speak about what will happen in the day after. In the day after all this destruction, you know, where is going to be the restitution? How is all of this going to be corrected? That's going to be the vision of Yeshayahu of chapter 4, what will come in the day after of all of this.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Rabbi, Diane, sorry, it was a question that was asked before. When they said the three things, I think it's in Sefer Mishpatim, you know, if you don't, you've got to look after your wife's kasutahu and atah, and so on and so forth. You said it, seorah kasutah. I didn't know, because that is also a Torah law, and the conjugal rights, they couldn't, that wasn't one of the Tanaim, wasn't one of the conditions. So why would those two, I've never heard this before, that a woman can forego it. I didn't know that one could.
Yes,
and I thought because it's a Torah law, you can't really. I mean, in time of crisis, of course, you can anything, but
no. Even Torah laws, we rule. There's a machlokit on this in the Gemara, but we rule like Rabbi Yehuda that even on Torah laws, if it's monetary stipulations, then you can make again, if both sides agree, then you can make your own conditions. Kol t'nai shebemamon kayam. It's the freedom of contract. So regarding monetary,
what do you call that, Diane? What do you call that?
In legal terms nowadays, it's called freedom of contract. Okay, that's what we call in halacha kol t'nai shebemamon kayam. So under monetary issues, you're free to make even Torah obligations like this, and to provide for the woman, they can be overridden by if they both stipulate otherwise, the men and the women. You have other examples for this. You know, the Torah has laws, for example, for shomer, if you're a guardian over somebody else's property.
Yes.
There are certain Torah laws what his obligations are, but all of those obligations, you know, if they both agree on other conditions and other obligations, then they're allowed to do that, because again, it's a monetary issue. So you have freedom of contract.
Like a heta iska.
Well, actually, that's rebate is an actual exception to this rule, because by taking interest, that the Torah prohibits even if the borrower agrees. So actually, by rebate, you don't have freedom of contract. The heter iska is a workaround to sort of allow you to take interest, but not really taking interest. So heter iska is not an example of freedom of contract. Heter iska is sort of an example where we're trying to sort of finding a loophole in the system. Okay, so it's a little different.
So how do you say in Hebrew freedom of contract? You're saying it too quickly, Diane.
Well, in halacha, the term is kol t'nai shebemamon kayam.
Kol hatanai.
Kol t'nai shebemamon kayam. Any condition on monetary issues is kayam, is valid. That's the halachic concept of.
Okay.
I think that's parallel to what you would call in legal term nowadays freedom of contract.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very much.